It's the year ending Friday the 31st of December 2021, and this is the Year Unwrapped. In the past 12 months, we've seen over 8 billion COVID-19 vaccines given globally, a deadly insurrection at Capitol Hill, a container ship blocking the Suez Canal for nearly a week, and the death of the Duke of Edinburgh at the age of 99. But we're here to consider some of the trends that passed under the radar this year. Big changes that haven't made headlines, but are slowly affecting the way we live our lives. I'm Ollie Mann, and let's unwrap the year. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Joe Evans. From daily history podcast The Retrospectors, it's Arian McNichol. And back on the show, I haven't seen you since September, it is freelancer Sachandrika Chakrabarti. Where have you been all my life? What have you been doing?
I don't know. Nothing of note.
Cheating on you with other podcasts.
But all right, we weren't going to talk about that.
Surely nothing could be more important than participating in this podcast. Arian, you are kicking us off. What do you think 2021 should be remembered for?
After the baby boom a few generations back, have we now reached the baby bust?
And at the same time, since we now know that we have a limited window of demographic opportunity, it's important for us to start preparing now to eventually be able to, cater to an aging population, which is going to be a challenge, say, in 2-3 decades, when our average population is older, so greater emphasis on social security, on geriatric care, etc. is really, really important.
An extract from the Business Standard podcast from November. Arian, what was the story?
Yeah, so on November the 24th, India's government declared that the country's total fertility rate had dropped to 2.0 children per woman, and that's below the replacement rate of 2.1, which is the rate at which new births are sufficient to maintain a steady population in a country. So this is pretty momentous news with quite enormous ramifications for India, but more broadly indicates that the population of the entire world will likely peak earlier than had previously been thought and at a lower level, and then begin to decline more rapidly. And this, of course, will have huge consequences for all of us, of the economic and the social and the environmental kind. So, it was a story that caught my eye.
Well, it will have huge consequences for all of us if other countries follow suit, and if population is in decline, as opposed to we normally hear about growth. But actually, in the case of India, its growth rate is slowing. It actually isn't in decline, is it?
Well, that's right. This total fertility rate, which is often abbreviated to TFR, is an indication of what is to come. So basically, there's still going to be this larger population that is growing up based on the fact that their TFR was above 2.1 a few years back, but increasingly, what's going to happen in the very near future is actually that the population will start to decrease.
So, Chandrika, why is India's growth rate slowing down? And do you think other countries will follow suit?
It seems a bit of a surprise because for India, this has been a real issue for a lot of the 20th century. And there have been lots of leaders trying to take different measures to try and curb the population, lots of conversations around what to do with that. In the 70s, Indira Gandhi had a kind of horrifying mass sterilisation program that has been, exactly, it's a really low point in India's history. But it has been an issue. It's been one of the biggest countries in the world for a long time. And in terms of growth and economic power, it's always been one of the countries that's coming up and going to be one of the big superpowers in the future. But this does make us think, again, is that actually going to happen if the population stabilizes and then starts falling? So a couple of the things that have changed people's attitudes to childbearing have been certainly contraception. So that's been quite an increase in the proportion of women who are using contraception. That's gone up from 54% to 67% in the last few decades. And then also the unmet need for contraceptives has fallen. So what we're looking at is actually greater rights for women and a greater ability to plan their lives, which does feel like a real positive. Then the proportion of teenage marriages has decreased. Again, feels like a great positive, particularly for women. And there's been an improvement in the gender balance. So historically, there's been a preference for male children and perhaps not always carrying female children to term, but now for every 1,000 baby boys, there are now 929 baby girls. And then that is up from 5 years ago when there was 1,000 to 919. It also means that in terms of marriage, that there are fewer men sort of left on the shelf in that sense.
And India came up at COP26, obviously, Joe, as well this year. Might this scenario help them curb their greenhouse gas emissions as well. We sort of need the global population to reduce to help with the climate crisis, don't we?
No, that's absolutely right. And a burgeoning population is obviously often seen in the longer term, especially as a hurdle to development, as we've already mentioned, but also as a driver of economic damage and greenhouse gas emissions. So there certainly is a positive element there, and that's one of the reasons that Indian leaders have been trying to curb high birth rates for such a long time. I think where this is very interesting is that people often talk about the sort of concept of overpopulation, and this has been a massive issue for a long, long time for many, many people. At COP26, as you mentioned, people may have seen, if they were watching the news coverage, that there was a sort of large inflatable baby outside that was put there by a group called Population Matters, and the baby was wearing a T-shirt that said "Smaller families, cooler planet." These figures do suggest that the UN is going to have to slightly downgrade its peak population forecasts, suggesting that those groups are perhaps barking up the wrong tree slightly when it comes to climate change. And it does also remind me of where this idea of overpopulation came from as well, somewhat, because this idea was popularised by a Stanford entomologist called Paul Ehrlich in a book called The Population Bomb. In that book, he essentially argued, hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death. The environment will be destroyed because of a substantial increase in the number of people on the planet. And it does suggest that actually those forecasts, which have been popularly debunked for quite some time now, are turning out not actually to have been as accurate as perhaps they seemed in the late 60s when that book was published.
But I'm going to ask you this, Aaron, because you seem to be on top of the statistics here. Doesn't it depend how you measure it? Because even if, by every account, it is true that India's birth rate is slowing, it's still got many more people there than there were, I don't know, pick a date, 100, 200, 500 years ago. The population of the planet is exponentially growing, isn't it? So it's sort of these little blips are irrelevant if what you're talking about is the future of the planet.
Well, but all of these little blips, particularly in a country that is forecast to overtake the most populous country in the world currently, that's China, within the next decade, count massively. And India is a very important case in point because currently its population is 1.4 billion, and that's expected to rise by 2050 to a peak of 1.6 billion and then kind of stabilize and then return to 1.4 billion by 2100. Then it will start declining again. And I think that if we look at the global population, the previous UN estimate had the world's population sort of tipping just under 10 billion people. And I think that now with this sort of rapid increase, or rather this rapidly decreasing fertility rate in India, I think those figures are going to need to be revised. And I think that the consequences for the world are astonishing, particularly when you consider the idea that as soon as you reach that point where the world stops reproducing at the rate that it has been, stops accelerating in terms of its population growth, then you start to get the potential in the slightly longer term of an aging population. And soon enough, there will be more older people than there are younger people.
I knew there'd be a drawback somewhere. So there we are. So
Yeah.
the planet's saved, Sir Chandrika, but old people aren't going to have anyone to look after them. Is that where we're going with this?
Yes, when you say old people, you kind of mean us, don't we? Who's going to look after us? Yeah, there are lots of changes when you have an aging population. I mean, just look at the Brexit vote, like how we vote kind of changes, but also in terms of accumulating property, like getting mortgages. We're not going to be doing that in our old age, but what we do need is state money to pay for our care, to pay for our pensions, to pay for the fact that we won't be able to work, probably, unless we're all shackled to our laptops for the rest of eternity. So we just can't do the same things in our 80s that we could do in our 20s. And that will have a huge effect on GDP, on so many things, on defense, on who's in the army, navy and air force. So yeah, if we kind of tip the population towards the aging end of things, what can actually be achieved within a country will really change.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it, Joe? Because particularly developing countries want to curb their growth rate, but also don't want to get to a situation where it's going to affect their economy because there aren't enough people to make money.
No, you're absolutely right. The danger of an ageing population is what we've just described, this top-heavy economic structure where lots of the wealth property is accumulated at one end of the society, the older end, and it makes it very, very difficult for younger people to do such simple things as get on the housing ladder, is an example that we see in the United Kingdom. The flip side of that is that a lower fertility rate does create the opportunity for a thing called demographic dividend, which is a term that refers to the growth potential based upon shifts in a population's age structure. So it's mainly when the share of the working age population is larger than the non-working age share of the population. in countries, for example, that are full of people in their 20s without massive families, lots of children to care for, these economies can become incredibly buoyant and dynamic because they don't have a young population that is tied down and has a large number of dependents that are relying on them, so they can take greater risks in business, they can potentially spend longer working, they can commit more time to their work. And so these things are a key element of economic modernization. And so in the case of a country like India, which is a rapidly developing country, this is a huge potential for massive economic growth, which is obviously good for us all and potentially in the long term solves the top-heavy economic situation with an older population.
Could it exacerbate religious tensions, though, Aryan? Because there is a Hindu-Muslim divide in India, isn't there, in the sense that, obviously it's difficult to generalise, but clearly there are more Muslim than Hindu families where you have people with multiple wives who reject family planning. You can imagine people in India saying, OK, there are fewer people being born. That really means there are fewer people being born to Hindu or Christian families, but Muslims are multiplying. And that is going to exacerbate tensions that exist in that country.
Yeah, I mean, this does definitely, all of these statistics point to a widening gap between the north and the south of the country. Already there was a long-standing gap in population growth in both parts, but the large poorer tract that lines the sort of northern Ganges river continues to show a higher fertility rate, with women in the Bihar state having an average of 3 children each, and meanwhile southern states have lower fertility rates. And what that means, I suppose, is that you will get this sort of divide between country and urban, and I think that's going to be seen not just in India but globally. And the trend is for, as countries become wealthier and as people become more urban, then this is the way that the growth rate goes. And all of those impacts are going to also be massive in terms of the geopolitical shifts that we see, because, the two areas of the world that are still growing are Africa and the Arab world, while Europe and Asia are the places that are going to see their fertility rate dropping off most swiftly. And I read this piece by Dr. Richard Horton, who's the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, who said that basically what this means is that the world will become more multipolar, with India and Nigeria and China and the US as the dominant powers altogether. So, you've just got this massive shift in the way we understand the world and where the power lies.
There's something a bit uncomfortable about the terminology, isn't there, Sachandrika, but behind this conversation politically, though? Aryan made reference to the replacement level. You were talking about forced sterilisation. I mean, when the government actually get involved in trying to determine this, it feels icky. You're talking about families and individuals and their choices.
Yeah, it's really weird, isn't it, to talk about it in this sense, because what we're talking about here, I'm not seeing amongst my peers and amongst my friends who seem to be having like 1 or 2 children each. It seems to be, we're replacing each other. But we do have to think on a macro scale. We do have to think what's happening in this country and what's happening in the wider world. And the fact is that in the mid-80s, when some of us were born, the world fertility rate was 3.5 children per woman. And now it's just down to 2.4 in 2019. So within sort of 30, 40 years, it's dropped by that much. And it is worth thinking this doesn't happen outside of economic reasons and social reasons. What's going on? Is it the move to cities? One of my favorite subjects. Is it the lack of social welfare safety nets? What is it that's really pushing this? And also the question of, well, do we need large families in the same way we did when we sort of had land and farms and we needed to put children to work? We don't need to do that anymore. So what do we have children for, I guess, and how does that fit into planning the future of a country?
To look after us when we're old, Joe.
It's worth noting here how racialised this conversation always has been, incidentally, about overpopulation. I mentioned Paul Ehrlich's book earlier, The Population Bomb, which was the thing really that triggered, kind of panic within, the Population Council, the International Planned Parenthood Federation. These things kind of sprung up out of this moral panic. But then also, the United Nations Population Fund, the World Bank, they were also discussing this book, which at first didn't really catch anyone's attention and then sort of became a sort of cult hit that spiraled into something more popular. At the beginning of that book, Ehrlich describes a cab ride that he took with his family in Delhi, and he sort of describes Delhi as this sort of incredibly backwards, hopping with fleas, crowded slums, this kind of thing. It's worth noting at the time the population of New Delhi was something around 2.8 million, and by comparison the population of Paris was 8 million. these comparisons about overpopulation and the way that we talk about these things has always been tainted with this slightly uncomfortable racialized language. And I think it's worth noting that when we then discuss sort of declining population rates and the way that it's going to change the way that we view geopolitics and the way that it has the potential to change power dynamics, because that permutation of racialism and racism has always sort of run very clearly through this topic.
I think that's really true, Joe, and I think that one of the immediate potential fixes that some people have suggested to those countries that have a declining fertility rate is the idea of a more liberal immigration policy. But that already gets you rubbing up against this whole other racial issue that has haunted particularly the developed world of closing down borders rather than opening them up. But that may simply be the most obvious short-term solution to the problem, is getting more people in to replace the fact that you're not breeding in the same numbers as you used to be breeding as a country. But what that means in terms of world power is yet another kind of brain drain in those parts of the world where you would be taking workers from. It's obviously a bit of a zero-sum game if you start to do this. So it opens up really massive questions where you're looking to sort of find a solution in the first place. So I think that there's, the issue itself is massive, but the solutions are non-obvious.
Yeah. Our grandchildren might have to emigrate to India to look after their older population.
Right. Yeah.
That's a thought. Joe, you're up next after this. Okay, Joe, your turn. What does Mr. Foreign Policy reckon 2021 should be remembered for?
Is this the year the world lost its police force?
This decision about Afghanistan is not just about Afghanistan. It's about ending an era of major military operations to remake other countries. We saw a mission of counterterrorism in Afghanistan, getting the terrorists and stopping attacks.
The second most important Joe on this podcast, President Biden, talking at the White House 24 hours after the last US soldiers left Kabul in August. Now, Joe, this was a big story. So what did we miss?
It was a big story, but I think the thing that is very interesting about this, and I think the thing that has the biggest ramifications really as a result of the decision for US and NATO forces to withdraw from Afghanistan, is what Joe Biden is talking about there. It's this decision and this seeming shift in foreign policy from the US and by extension NATO to stop nation building, to stop what appears to be foreign intervention, which for the last 2 decades and even longer have really been mainstays of Western foreign policy.
Yeah, because, people commented on the withdrawal from Afghanistan like it was all done in a rush, but obviously it was part of a long-term strategy. He said back in April that the United States from now on must stay clearly focused on the fundamental national security interest of the USA. That's the current policy, which means no interventions of the types we saw in the George W. Bush era.
Absolutely. The Donald Trump era of the American presidency was defined by the term America First. What Biden articulates in that speech is very close to an America First related foreign policy. It's far closer to Trumpist America First than, say, Obama's 2009 troop surge. What he did in that speech really was define a new era in US foreign policy. One that relies less on military muscle and one that's looking to sort of turn the page on the US's traditional role abroad and points to a less interventionist future. Given the US's massive influence within NATO, I think that has really, really important implications for the way that Western powers will carry themselves on the world stage looking into the next decade and beyond. Yes,
Sachandrika, is it strategically the right thing for the United States to do long term, or is it just responding to the realpolitik of the fact that, as Joe just said, Trump got elected by telling people there wouldn't be any more wars of this kind because that's what the public want to hear at the moment, and they still want to hear it from Biden?
It does feel that America needs to look inwards and do some housekeeping at home, because even though the Trump era, hopefully not number one, hopefully the only one, is over, the fallout is still there. I mean, they had an insurrection to the capital on the 6th of January this year. They've got huge problems at home. They do need to deal with them. But in terms of what happens when you leave Afghanistan, like famously an unconquerable land, it does seem that China and Russia might be moving in and seeing it as a kind of playground for themselves to exercise their power, see what they can get out of it, and kind of be quite anti-American. So there have been Chinese internet users joking that the power transition in Afghanistan was even more smooth than the presidential transition in the US. So the US is starting to become just another country they can joke about, not the kind of the head of the police that runs how the world should work. As Joe's mentioned, the police force is kind of disappearing if America isn't doing that job anymore. And so Beijing, they've welcomed the Taliban. They're seemingly wanting to work with them. And also, I mean, Russia's kind of doing quite a lot of what it wants. They're kind of lining up on the border to Ukraine, and they're also trying to exercise their influence in Afghanistan. So it does seem this vacuum has been left behind, but also that America has got a lot of its own problems to deal with on the domestic side of things.
So, yes, Arian, this might not be a great long-term strategy. You know, we'll deal with what's happening at home, but we know we're handing some sort of victory to China and Russia here, or at least ground that we used to occupy. Do you think that's what Biden's thinking?
I mean, the complexity of it is that for a long time, I think the argument about the US using force and being the global police force was this sort of idea, at least internally within America, of ideological superiority. They had this sense that they were the country that had the best possible version of democracy, and they alone were in a position to spread their culture and their idea of freedom to the world. But I think, you know, as we're sort of touching on, that shift from even as recently as kind of Bill Clinton's Madeleine Albright describing America as the indispensable nation, kind of picking on that sense of ideological mission, to Donald Trump, has shifted America in its own sense of what it needs to do when it goes out to the world. And I think the world is comprehending that shift as well. There was an amazing moment where one senior administration official was asked to define the Trump doctrine, and he said, "It's this: we're America, bitches." That was like his idea of what America represented to the world, and I think that represents a really fundamental shift in terms of what America's mission is, if it is the global police force as your sort of starting point.
Do you think it would have been different, Joe, this whole situation, if they'd won? I mean, I know Afghanistan doesn't get talked about much because it went on for 2 decades in terms of winning and losing. But if you look at it from George W. Bush's original goals, the war on terror, they lost, didn't they? America lost. That's what happened this year. They realised they couldn't win in Afghanistan. Do you think if some way they had won, we'd be in a different situation now? They'd be feeling themselves a bit more.
I think this is certainly a situation that is born out of actually not just Afghanistan, but really 2 wars back-to-back in which America was, you know, at best fought to a standstill, at best defeated, because at the late end of the 20th century you have the war in Vietnam, and obviously at the beginning of the 21st century you have the war in Afghanistan, and also by extension the war in Iraq. I think it's certainly the case that this shift has come about in part because of those 2, as I say, either defeats or if not defeat, then stalemates. Partly because this notion of American foreign policy being something which should be muscular and should be on the world stage was really born out of the 1940s. And, you know, this notion of the American century, as it was defined by Times publisher at the time, Henry Luce, was really born out of the idea that the US should intervene in the Second World War because it needed to preserve democratic values and that it had a responsibility on the world stage to stand up and fight for those things. Obviously, critics can debate the extent to which that sort of ideal has held true throughout the rest of its foreign interventions since. But I think certainly there is an element of the US having sort of had to put its tail between its legs on 2 occasions now, 2 very large, expensive and embarrassing foreign expeditions, which have both ended in, frankly, having to flee. You know, we had the comparisons between the helicopters taking off from the roof of the US Embassy in Saigon with the fall of Kabul. And I certainly think that this has sort of revealed 2 versions of America, one of which is still quite hawkish and which would like to go and intervene, and the other one, which seems to be prevailing in the White House, which is kind of reflecting on what American global dominance looks like now, how it should impose its will abroad, and it certainly seems as if that won't be through military action anymore.
Yes, except if you take Biden at his word that they're going to intervene again when the fundamental national security interest of the United States of America is at stake, then the situation they've left themselves in, where Afghanistan is once again being run by Sharia law and in the future potentially could harbour more groups like IS and Al-Qaeda that then threaten the United States, that would then again, 30 years later, become a situation where they would, by their own rubric, have to intervene because it does threaten their security interests. He hasn't really resolved it.
As you say, Joe Biden has said very clearly in that speech and since that the US will intervene again where the national interests of the US is a priority. The difficulty being that you can't simply withdraw from a territory for long periods of time, allow Russia and China, as we've already discussed, as just two examples, to expand into this vacuum and then expect to be able to go and intervene again in the same way that we did 2 decades ago in Afghanistan and Iraq, without there being wider geopolitical implications to doing so. I think that what happened in Syria is a perfect example of this, really, where the deployment of Russian operations in Syria really was transformational for Russia, and it's resulted in a situation where former US allies, Egypt, the Gulf states, Israel, are now listening to Moscow in a way that they never did before. There is then a wider issue, which is what exactly fits the definition of a US domestic or national security interest, because looking ahead to 2022, we've got China, making maneuvers towards Taiwan. We have the example of Russian troops marching on the Ukrainian border. Perhaps a slightly, less obviously pressing issue to US national security is a flare-up of potential violence in Bosnia. If we think back to the last time this happened, the only thing that stopped that was the internationalism of the Clinton administration being very forceful on the fact that the US and NATO should intervene to try and stop what was the first genocide in Europe since the Second World War. Now, whether any of those things will fit the loosely defined US national security or US domestic priority definition is a question. And so it then leaves us with the issue of, well, what exactly will America fight for now on the world stage? We don't know in the way that we used to do.
I think we also sometimes imagine that Joe Biden is a really stark contrast to Trump in ways that he isn't necessarily. We have in mind that, or perhaps before he was elected, we had in mind that Biden was going to be the antithesis to Trump. But as Noam Chomsky pointed out in an article I read in the New York Times, Biden hasn't shifted in a lot of really important ways from Trump's broad doctrine. For example, the embargo still sits on Cuba. There are still sanctions on Iran. He hasn't really budged from Trump's enormously controversial attitude to the Palestinians. And equally, in his first military budget in September, he asked for $253 billion US dollars. That's a 1.7% increase over the 2021 budget, which already had exceeded the defense spending of the next 13 countries in the world combined. America continues to spend so massively on its military, and so I don't think that we can yet say that we've seen a huge shift and even a huge disengagement from what America was doing under Trump happening with Biden these days.
But perhaps, Sachandrika, this is less to do with the United States at all and more to do with China. That if the 20th century was the American century, then the 21st century is the Chinese century. And actually, the US is just responding to that.
Yes, as I mentioned, Beijing was among the first to embrace the Taliban. They've already had them over in delegation. And so they're willing to put in lots of money, like hundreds of millions of dollars, to finance the reconstruction of critical infrastructure in Afghanistan if the Taliban does what Beijing says. So China is willing to underwrite what the Taliban is doing in Afghanistan if they get them to obey them. Yeah, basically, China are looking at sort of buying their trust, possibly, and maybe that will work better than trying to go in by force, because that seems to never work in Afghanistan.
And of course, they've got TikTok. And we never have you on the show, Sachandrika, without mentioning TikTok. And we will be doing that after this. Finally this year, Sachandrika, what should the last 12 months really be remembered for?
I mean, it all started with Tom from MySpace, but will it end in the destruction of democracy?
Journalists, that's one side, the old gatekeepers. The other is technology. With its godlike power, the new gatekeepers, it has allowed the virus of lies to infect each of us, pitting us against each other, bringing out our fears, anger, hate, and setting the stage for the rise of authoritarians and dictators around the world.
Maria Ressa at the Nobel Peace Prize awarding ceremony in December. What does this tell us about your moment of the year, Sachandrika?
So Maria Ressa, a much persecuted journalist from the Philippines, has become the first journalist of Filipino background to win the Nobel Prize. She did win it alongside a Russian journalist as well. But she has said we're at a sliding door moment, and you've got to love her bringing Gwyneth Paltrow into this, because why not? Referring to a 90s film. Love it. So she has said in her acceptance speech that the power of social media to disseminate fake news, to get people believing things that aren't true, that is the biggest threat to democracy at the moment. And you think, okay, I've heard this before, but what's really interesting is that she's saying the same things as very right-wing leaders of countries that are also really cracking down on social media. So, for instance, Turkey's Erdogan, President Erdogan said this week that when it first emerged, social media was hailed as a symbol of freedom, but now it has turned into one of the main sources of threats to today's democracy. So we're definitely entering into a period of techno-pessimism, which is an amazing term. And it goes to show that we were very positive about social change and how social media could affect that. I'm thinking about 2011, the Arab Spring, what's actually become of that really exciting time, not so much.
Okay, so what you're describing here, I mean, you're going back to 2011 already, isn't so much the year unwrapped as the decade, is it? Like, we already know, don't we, that, I mean, ever since the triumph of Brexit and Trump, that echo chambers exist, that democracy can be manipulated through social media. We know that, as you say, we've heard that. What's the thing this year that's tipped?
So it looks like there are more laws coming in that will actually put people who are reading social media and subscribing to certain accounts and people who run certain accounts in danger. And I think so far we haven't had protesters jailed and people just using the social media being jailed. So if we look at Turkey, for instance, they passed a law last year requiring social media platforms that have more than 1 million users to have a legal representative in the country. And now they're looking at having more laws around punishing protesters, people using social media to do as what they term sort of, upset democracy.
So in other words, techno-pessimism, this word you brought us, is telling us that social media can be dangerous. But is your proposal basically that techno-pessimism is in itself potentially dangerous because it clamps down on freedom of expression?
I think it is, yes, especially when both sides of the arguments, you've got Maria Ressa is very much on the left side, and you've got these sort of quite right-wing leaders, both saying the same thing, that social media is this evil. And in fact, it's about more than that, surely. It's about how we use social media. It's about the owners of social media companies. It's about moderation. And surely it's about educating people in media studies, which is always frowned upon. But actually, it's more important than ever because there's less gatekeeping and less context in terms of what media you're reading to say, well, this has a ring of authenticity. This seems true. This seems like this leader would say something like that. So actually educating people would help, because we can't put the lid back on the internet. It's going to be there.
Yeah, we were talking last week's show, Joe, about vaccine hesitancy and how that may have been accelerated by Facebook and the like. It is quite easy to build a case that this is sort of the story of the year, isn't it? Because it is the place where people get their stories.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. We're going through, obviously, a spike in COVID cases at the moment to end the year in the UK, and it's being driven in a large part by people who won't go and get vaccinated for exactly the reason that you discussed. And we kicked off the year with Trump supporters storming into the Capitol, as has been previously mentioned, based on the conspicuously false claims spread largely through echo chambers on the internet that Democrats and Joe Biden stole the election. I think what we're discussing here is a moment where there's a sort of consensus shift going on about exactly how the internet functions, and that it's been broken down into various groups, the most prominent of which you could probably draw out as being those on the right, like Erdogan, who are looking to control the internet through greater policing, often to the detriment of people, of dissidents and people that oppose his rule, which is something that's also seen in other countries. And then to the sort of left, you have people like Maria Ressa, who are more to the liberal left side of things, who are also concerned about the spread of, fake news and conspicuous lies on the internet, but would probably not argue for the kind of crackdown that people like Erdogan are supporting. I think that essentially what we're discovering, to use your example of it being sort of the decade unwrapped, is that the utopian vision of the internet and the impact it was meant to have on governance and on democracy and on uniting disparate people from around the world has actually turned quite sour. What we haven't quite decided yet is exactly sort of what the ointment or what the medicine to solve this situation is.
Except, Arian, if Erdogan doesn't like it, If Xi Jinping doesn't like it, then that suggests that it hasn't really moved so far away from freedom of expression, because that's why they don't like it.
Well, exactly. And I think that, we really are seeing that the price potentially for a free and open internet, it turns out, is the proliferation of such things as disinformation and hate speech and incitement and foreign interference in elections on the one hand, but also its use in places like Turkey, like China, for mass organization and mass mobilization. And I think the thing about social media is that it isn't inherently anti-democratic. It can be anything. For example, it was a citizen's video capturing the death of George Floyd and then broadcasting it on social media that changed the public conversation about police shootings of black Americans in the US. And on the other hand, it was very famously the mobilization of the Unite the Right group who rallied infamously in Charlottesville. So, there are ways that you can use social media to potentially benefit liberal or illiberal causes. And I think, as Joe's saying, what we're having to decide about is, do we want to put in place further regulation so as to curb the limits of the open internet on the one hand, so as to eliminate some of that hate speech and incitement and so on? Or do we want to continue to leave the internet open and free and accept that some things that aren't terribly palatable, particularly if you have a liberal sensitivity or sensibility to you, are going to continue to proliferate online?
I mean, the things that Chandrika are about saying, both Black Lives Matter and Unite the Right both use social media, sort of suggests that they're neutral platforms, whereas the point that people have when they're against social media companies running the conversation is that they're not. Their algorithms are designed to be inherently divisive. It doesn't matter what campaign is being discussed, what politics is at the centre of the conversation. The way they filter the conversation is to magnify it, polarize it, and upset people. That's the problem.
Yeah, so social media networks, they want to get maximum engagement. They want to have the eyeballs there. They always have a model where they end up selling advertising, basically. If you look at your Instagram accounts now, when you swipe downwards, you're getting more and more adverts than ever. So they always want to sell that attention. So how do you get people's attention? Well, the journalists among us have known this forever. You say something really polarizing, say something really divisive. You might have a fairly middle of the road article, but if you give it a really sensational headline, it will do the job for you. We've got that issue at the moment with things like Twitter, where people are just reading the headline and going, that has really angered me, or I really agree with that, and then getting in the comments underneath and really going for each other. So at the moment, I think does that feel like what Twitter and other social media networks are like? I think we've all got burnout in this stuff as well, but it does strike me that education is certainly part of what we need to be doing, because it's really hard to read tone online. It's really hard to know what someone's agenda is. There's a bit of a joke tweet going around at the moment, which is, does your tweet not cover all of my lived experience ever? Well, how very dare you? Which is a joke that's worthy of Twitter in 2021, which is that this tweet must be for everyone. And that's simply not true. Nothing can cover that. So I think what Maria Ressa is doing is saying, when we have journalists who are trying to give context and investigate things and sort of do journalism properly, then we've got something here, and that needs to be part of the internet. But what someone like Erdogan is trying to do is saying, well, it undercuts what governments do, so therefore we're going to call you all dissidents and we're going to clamp down on you in real life and make it quite a scary time for everyone.
And that doesn't just mean citizen journalists, does it, Joe? Certain leaders are able to lump in professional, accredited journalists as well in this kind of hodgepodge of confusion. Deutsche Welle has been banned in Belarus.
No, absolutely. And to go back to the January 6th insurrection on Capitol Hill, Donald Trump is a perfect example of this, right? Would probably not create a particularly strong distinction between White House accredited Washington Post journalists and people on the internet saying nasty things about him. The difficulty, I think, here as well is that we're talking here as if sort of social media is itself an inherently political place. And I think actually one of the complications here is that most people using these things are not particularly political people. The difficulty is that the people that are highly politically interested use it the most and are likely to have the most extreme opinions, and so are amplified by exactly the kind of algorithms you've just described. I think if we had a better understanding perhaps of how these things function, then people would actually be less inclined to become involved in the sort of outrage clicks and outrage responses that we've just described, because they would recognise the fact that actually the things they're being confronted with are not necessarily mainstream, they're not necessarily widely shared views. What they actually are is exactly the kind of content driving opinions that the algorithm and that the social media requires in order to make its advertising business model function. So we talk, as Sachandra just did, about sort of media education. I think there's also an element really in this of the fact that we all just need to slightly grow up and learn and recognise how these things function, and recognise that when we're dunking on that stupid tweet by that journalist or that commentator or that comedian, we're playing exactly the game that the social media algorithm wants us to play, and we'd be far better logging off and going outside than engaging with this stuff, which is essentially having a conversation on terms that we didn't agree to. These terms were agreed by Silicon Valley billionaires who require us to engage in order to be Silicon Valley billionaires.
Will that not become obvious, Arian, to a younger generation than us? I mean, I wonder if in 20 years' time people will just understand that because they've grown up with it.
I suspect absolutely. And I think also, we're still in the comparatively fledgling early days of social media, and what it represents to many older people, at least, is still a kind of boogeyman that can be responsible for whatever you want it to be responsible for. And I think it's become a convenient punching bag in the US in particular, where democracy has been wobbling a little bit, particularly under Trump and the Capitol insurrection that we saw. It's become a convenient place to try to regulate when, meanwhile, quite a lot of the democratic damage is being done by the then president himself and the Republican Party, traditional broadcast media, including the likes of Fox News and so on, radio, Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity, and then major newspapers such as the New York Post and then sort of websites like Breitbart. So it's not as if like social media alone is responsible for democratic damage, but it can be in the hands of those people who want to distract from their own contribution to the damage to democracy, a thing to point at and say we really need to crack down on this.
Them's just facts. No fake news here. And we are at Week Unwrapped on Twitter, if you're so inclined. My thanks to Joe, Arian and Sachandrika. That is it for this episode of The Year Unwrapped, and also indeed for the year itself on the podcast. Thank you so much for sticking with us this year and listening to the show. It has been a pleasure, as ever, to be in your ears. We know you have a choice of current affairs podcasts. Thank you for choosing this one. We will be back on Friday the 7th of January with a fresh new year of weekly podcasts. To get them delivered to your phone pronto, just follow the show for free by searching The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. Until next year, bye-bye.